Greetings, scholars. It's Brian again. Last time we talked about ethical reasoning, but sometimes actors are not very ethical. What happens when an advocate is not using ethical reasoning? Well, sometimes that's what we call a fallacy. Fallacies indicate an error or a weakness in argument. They don't indicate that the argument's not true or that it's not believed, just that there's something wrong with the reasoning process. The source of a fallacy can be in anything, the data, the reasoning, the language used. It can be in the psychological basis of the argument. And the funny thing about fallacies, and you heard it here first, folks, they're actually believed. So lots of times, fallacious arguments by non-ethical advocates, they function just as well as others, and they go through their daily life or things. Why should we know about fallacies? Not only to help us avoid our own mistakes, but also to identify others' faulty arguments. So we're going to try and identify several different categories of fallacies, and maybe some of these will be useful in your everyday life. Let me start off with the begging the question fallacy, or the circular reasoning. This occurs when an arguer assumes as a premise the conclusion that he or she intends to prove. In other words, they're arguing for a conclusion, but the conclusion has already been assumed in that. If someone's engaged in circular reasoning, that means that they've already taken the point they're trying to prove as part of the premise for things. Let me talk a second type of fallacy, the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition assumes that what's true of separate parts is true of the collective whole. I'll make an example here. You love fruit, don't you? Everybody loves fruit. Everybody loves cake. Who doesn't love cake? Birthday cake? Count me in. What if you put them together? Fruit cake? No. Fruit cake is terrible. What's true of fruit and true of cake is not true when the two are put together. That's actually a joke by Jim Gaffigan I'm using there, where the fallacy of composition is at play. Just because they're delicious individually doesn't mean that when they're put into a collective, they're going to be wonderful. Now, the other side of that's called the fallacy of division. The fallacy of division assumes that what's true of the collective is also true of its separate parts. Let's go back to the fruitcake. Fruitcake is terrible, but fruit tastes good and cake tastes good, so we've got the fallacy of division there. Another example, an airplane can fly through the air, but an airplane engine can't fly through the air on its own. There's the fallacy of division. Fourth type of fallacy we call the hasty generalization. The hasty generalization occurs when an argument by example has too few instances. This is common parlance. You might hear this word in your everyday. Someone does a hasty generalization when they say, well, 50 cows giving milk means all cows give milk. That's a hasty generalization. There are not enough examples used in that. And it's our process of understanding induction that tells us that that's the process that makes that a fallacious argument. Another type of fallacy is called the non sequitur. In Latin, the non sequitur, because many of these come from studies of Latin, it translates something literally as it does not follow. This is a fallacy that indicates that the conclusion or the claim that's being made doesn't reasonably follow from the argument or data that's offered as support. You also might hear this fallacy called a red herring. By the way, the origin of the red herring, it has to do with escaped convicts. It turns out that in Europe, in the period of rationalization and enlightenment that this is going on, convicts would escape from prison all the time, and red herring, a particularly smelly pickled fish, was available, and convicts would rub themselves with that, and that would throw off the scent of the bloodhound gang trying to catch them. So that red herring literally refers to being thrown off the scent of argument, the non sequitur or the red herring. Next type of fallacy we call the ad verecundium, again Latin. The ad verecundium is an argument based on a generalized appeal to authority. We already talked about argument authority. It doesn't have a lot of basis, but sometimes arguments rely on the solely on the status of a source rather than on that source's expertise. When someone says, we ought to have the Olympics in Chicago because Oprah said so, well, Oprah is a wonderful person, but she's not an expert on the Olympics or other political situations going on there. So we've got the ad verecundium going on there, the faulty use of authority that's not available. Next type of fallacy we call the ad misericordiam. I'm giving you these names in Latin. This is the fallacy that calls for acceptance of an appeal based solely on pity or sympathy, the overly emotional appeal. Do you remember that advertisement with the Sarah McLachlan song about giving to animal shelters, how it showed these depraved conditions of the animals, and it tried to spur you to emotion? That was the ad misericordiam. That was the faulty use of sympathy and pity tactics to try and get you motivated into action. Next fallacy you've got is the ad hominem. Now this one's used in common language. It literally translates as against the person, or, Latin was a gendered language, against the man. The ad hominem fallacy uses personal attacks in order to divert attention away from the substance of a controversy. So anytime you have an advocate arguing that it's the source of the argument, it's the source of the person that is the problem, not the argument itself, you've got an ad hominem attack. This is really common in politics. Politic attack ads, they often attempt to use the ad hominem fallacy to sway voters' opinions. And again, they're actually very productive. They do change public opinion in that. And in fact, changing someone's opinion of an individual character a lot of times means the audience doesn't support their political views. So you got to be careful for the use of ad hominem attack in those particular things. The next type of fallacy that we've got is the ad ignorantium. This is an argument based on an attempt to prove an argument based on its opposite can't be proven. We see this in the alien controversy all the time. You can't prove aliens didn't do this, and so my friend who hosts the Ancient Aliens show says that means aliens did it. This is the ad ignorantium. You can't prove it, or the argument is based off of ignorance itself. There's no actual proof for the argument. There's another fallacy called ignoring the question. It's a fallacy in which the arguer mistakes the conclusion to be proven when they attempt to prove it has no importance. Somebody says, I don't see why deforestation is so bad. There are many, many uses of wood. Well, they haven't actually refuted the actual claim. The logic and reasoning is based on a faulty assumption there itself. We've also got the fallacy of causation. We talked about the problem of causation versus correlation. Well, one of our fallacies is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Literally translates as after, therefore, because of. So this is a fallacy in which the advocate thinks that just because things are correlated in time, there was necessarily causation there. We see this all of the time in which someone says, that thing caused that other thing, so they make a reasoning based on that. Now you've got to be more strict on that. You've got to test correlation and causation like we did. Next type of fallacy we've got is the generic fallacy. The generic fallacy occurs when an advocate claims that their argument should be accepted or rejected because it's identified with a particular individual or a group. So this is the Hitler believed that same thing, or did that same thing, or was involved in that same thing, so it must be bad. You might have heard somebody say Hitler was a vegetarian, so all vegetarians are therefore fascist. This is the generic fallacy, the identification with a particular individual or a particular group going on. Now, if it's a good person or a bad person, it can still be used for this fallacy. So sometimes it's you should agree with this because somebody does it. Sometimes it's you should not agree with this. Our next form of fallacy is called the slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope fallacy occurs when an arguer claims that once we begin moving in a certain direction, we'll be forced to accept the most extreme form in that action. We see this all the time. The analogy is once a snowball starts rolling down a hill, it gains speed, it can't be stopped, it can't be altered. This is the slippery slope fallacy. We've also got the straw argument fallacy. This one's a little bit complicated to explain. This is when an arguer doesn't actually refute the main point made, but instead sets up an artificial argument that they can then knock down. The analogy has to do with learning to box in a different age in which someone would set up straw men to learn boxing and then defeat those straw men and think that they were great boxers. So in this instance, the advocate doesn't refute the argument. They actually take a caricature, a simpler version, a straw version of the argument. They refute that, and then they say, oh, I've actually refuted the point that's being made. So that's the straw person fallacy that's being made there. We also have the ad populum fallacy. The ad populum is the appeal to the people. That's the idea that you should agree with this claim just because it's popular, just because a lot of people follow this. Think about car advertisements. Car advertisements often say this is the best-selling car in its class. It's nothing about the car that's good, it's just that most people like it, most people agree with it. So that's the ad populum fallacy. Sometimes this is called the bandwagon fallacy. Same exact thing. The idea is get on the bandwagon. Finally, we've got the plurium interrogatum, the multiple questions. This is when you have an arguer that uses a trick question based on a false assumption, or they use so many questions that they reasonably be answered. Someone asks you the question, how long have you been cheating on your exams? That's really a trick question because you can't answer that question without admitting some sort of guilt there. That's also a form of fallacy. So that form of questioning in and of itself, it creates a problem. So there we've got many different fallacies listed, and I could go on and on about these. There are thousands of fallacies. We could do an entire course on fallacies, but let's not. Let's just save it for those and see if we can identify those very common fallacies as they come up in advocacy. Good luck, scholars.